and the more all the various intelligences in my body can be coordinated in my expression. Okay, so this is the human anatomy from this point of view. And it needs a lot of work, you can see, right? I mean, how to actually analyze this exactly. Like, I'd forgotten the motor consciousnesses, right, this morning, right? And so what are the actual divisions in the unconscious in this way? Like, can we learn to communicate with the different intelligences making us up? Some work is being done with this in terms of, is it Bonnie Bainbridge? There's a lot of people do this work where they'll sort of lie on the floor and they'll go inside and they'll start to communicate with their cells and communicate with their different organs and so forth. So all that kind of work would be very helpful. And we need to do empirical work, beginning to sort out what are the basic categories here? How do they look? What kinds of interactions can we identify? And then also in psychology, where we do work with the subpersonalities, right, we can begin to see that as part of this larger context. And then remember, there are also these other transphysical entities which are not embodied. For example, succubuses and incubuses and angels and demons and disincarnate human beings and so forth. And they can mimic our own subpersonalities, so that sometimes we can't tell whether some voice in our head is our voice or somebody else's voice. Sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not. Also, we can share subpersonalities with each other. So that, for example, my father is very critical of himself. And my father in my psyche is often critical of me. But maybe I am sharing his critic with him. So that we share a common subpersonality. You see, the possibilities here are very large, and in a certain sense it seems to multiply confusion, but in another sense it gives us a way of investigation. If we start with a model something like this and begin to rethink our psychological science, we might come up with some very, very interesting different perspectives. That'd be very helpful. All right. So then the question is, what happens to us when we die? I'll go back here for a minute. The simple answer is that we drop the macromolecules, right? So that at some level of our being, let's say it's cellular, maybe it's at a higher level, I don't exactly know, right? But at some level of our being, some of our intelligences lose interest in the physical world. We can understand aging this way in some way, you know, is that our higher intelligences lose interest in the particular physical body that we are inhabiting, and then that physical body begins to age, and then at some point it loses cohesion and it dies. But all of this, the whole Megillah, right, the whole complex of beings that make up our personality can continue on in the vital and mental world. This is the whole idea of life after death. And this explains it, I think, extremely well, because it is the case that the personality we have in the afterlife is always assumed to be the personality that we developed during life. So this personality, the personality that you are with your name, will continue on after you die in these other worlds. That's the afterlife, right? Okay, so from this point of view, the afterlife is fairly easy to explain. Our integrated personality, which is formed during our life, continues, it's already in the vital world. I am already an astral being, a vital being. I am already a mental being. My personality is in fact not part of the physical world. It lives in another world. And when the physical body drops away, there I am in that other world. You know, yesterday I talked about how we could start sitting where we are, and we could withdraw our attention from the senses and start daydreaming, and then go from the daydream into an active imagination, and go from the active imagination into a lucid dream or an out-of-body experience. That could happen right now. We're already there. But right now, we are paying most of our attention to the data from the physical senses. That's what it means to be awake. But if we withdraw from the physical senses, we find ourselves existing in another world. This is what happens right now. And then it's also what happens when we die. We lose the physical senses, and then we just wake up in the world that we're already in. But we're there now. And with the proper direction of our attention, we can experience that. We just haven't cultivated that ability to any great degree. So the afterlife on this model is not very difficult to explain, and neither is communication with deceased people, because those people can communicate with us telepathically and empathically, and it's just a question of our ability to pay attention to them. You with me on that? But then the question is, what about reincarnation? And reincarnation is much more difficult to explain, and it requires us to go further afield. So I want to lay out 4 theories of reincarnation which are compatible with this worldview that we're discussing, without really necessarily trying to say which is the real one. So one theory of reincarnation is that there is no reincarnation. And that theory would go like this, that due to the circumstances of the universe, due to the operation of the universe, a new personality is born with the body. So that at the formation of the zygote is not just the formation of a physical body, it also includes some higher grade matter with it. So we can imagine, for example, that the parents contribute part of their vital and mental bodies to the new fetus, along with the DNA that they transmit. And so a new personality is formed at birth, and then that personality dies at death, and that's all she wrote. Then another personality comes up. And so each personality is completely unique, and there is nothing which we could call reincarnation. That's one possible theory. Another theory, which I call the causal theory of reincarnation, it's also the Buddhist theory of reincarnation, is that we're born and we live for a while, our dominant personality, and then we die, and there's a gap. And then at some point in the future and somewhere in space, another personality forms, another body forms, another zygote forms, but there is a causal continuity between the personalities in each of these, so that the last moment of my death has the kind of causal connection to the first moment of that birth as one moment of my being has to the next moment of my being. Right? Make sense? Okay, so that's another theory of reincarnation. And this, as I say, this is the Buddhist theory of reincarnation. This is why they can say there's no self. There is simply a sequence of actual occasions. They would say it differently, but a sequence of actual occasions which ends and then begins in a new environment. Right? This is also like what happens in Star Trek when they beam somewhere. Right? First they're over here, and then they're over there, and there's nothing in between. Right? They don't travel the intervening space. They're just here and then there. Or imagine, for example, that somebody drugs you and brings you to another city, and then you wake up and you're somewhere else, and you have no memory of what happens in between. You can still function, and so that's the idea here: is that there are these causal gaps, spatiotemporal gaps in the transmission of causes which makes up a personality, and so the new personality then finds itself in a new body. That's another theory of reincarnation. It's an appealing one, in that it's very conceptually minimal. Now, another theory is the causal theory with an afterlife. Right? So then we would have a life in the physical body, die to the physical body, have a life in the astral body, die in the astral body, have a life in the mental body, die there, and come back in a new physical body, with a gap of time and space in between here. Right? But that basically we simply have a causal continuity in the personal order which characterizes the sequence of actual occasions constituting our personality. That's another plausible theory of reincarnation. But finally, there's a soul theory of reincarnation. And these diagrams are quite simplified, but that's all right. The soul theory of reincarnation says that when we're born, there is some entity, which we call the soul, which somehow pulls together the vital and mental matter that ends up inhabiting the fetus, the zygote, right? And then we have a physical life. And notice that the way the situation is set up, the way evolution has set things up, while we're alive, 95% of our personality formation happens while we're awake. We don't do a lot of interesting developmental work while we're asleep. This is not true for all of us. Some of us become lucid dreamers and begin to have all kinds of interesting formative experiences while we're asleep. But most of us just dream away our night times. We don't do very much with them. And so our personality is generally formed by our waking life. And then when we die, the personality that we have formed when we're awake finds itself in the astral world, in the vital world. So in effect, we lose our physical body and we find ourselves trapped in the dream world. Now, the way we have lived very strongly conditions the experience that we have on the other side. Just as we know what's happening in our lives is often reflected in our dreams, because in the vital world, the environment we're in always correlates with the mood that we're in. The way we locomote in the subtle worlds, in the vital worlds, is by changing our feeling state. That's how people move in that world. And so if we die in the midst of a horrible, bitter rage, we will end up in some place in the vital world that corresponds to that. We will end up in a hellish situation. And if we die in bliss and happiness, we'll end up in a heaven-like situation. So there's some justification here for the myth of heaven and hell, but the difference is that here it's purely temporary. It's an expression of our own mood. So it's sort of purgatorial in the sense that as our mood finally settles, we're freed from that particular location. Also, we differ among us in our degree of mental lucidity, right? So we all know people who live as if they're dreaming, right? We know people, for example, who've been married 5 times to the same kind of person and made the same mistake over and over again, right? Or we know people who just seem to go through life in a never-ending series of crises that never ends, and they never change their behavior. Just as we do in dreams, or sometimes we'll repeat the same painful thing over and over again, right? So life can be quite dreamlike, and for many people it is quite dreamlike.